Penguin Random House Audio presents Presidents at War, How World War II Shaped a Generation of Presidents from Eisenhower and JFK through Reagan and Bush, by Stephen M. Gillon. Read for you by Fred Sanders. To My Mom, June C. Gillon. Preface. January 20th, 1961. It was a cold, blustery day in Washington, D.C., as John F. Kennedy, a two-term Democratic senator from Massachusetts, prepared to take the oath of office to become the 35th President of the United States. JFK sat in the second of four leather chairs arranged in a semicircle around the inaugural platform on the freshly painted east portico of the White House. To his right sat outgoing President Dwight Eisenhower. On his left were Vice President-elect Lyndon Johnson, and then the outgoing Vice President and JFK's vanquished 1960 opponent, Richard Nixon. There was a clear changing of the guard taking place. At 43, the tanned and youthful JFK was the youngest man ever elected to the presidency. He was replacing Eisenhower, who, at 70, was the oldest up to that time. The last president born in the 19th century was passing on the reins to the firstborn in the 20th. Despite the festive mood and the happy faces, deep resentments burned just beneath the surface. Kennedy respected Eisenhower as a general, but not as a person. He often dismissed him as that old asshole. Throughout the campaign, JFK attacked Eisenhower's policies and the man himself, creating a portrait of a befuddled president who was over his head in the White House, incapable of leading the nation in a dangerous world. But Ike was immensely popular, and Kennedy needed his support, especially on foreign policy issues. For his part, Ike found JFK inexperienced and arrogant, dismissing him as that young whippersnapper or little boy blue. Although Nixon had faithfully served Eisenhower for 8 years as his vice president, Ike never forgave him for refusing to withdraw from the ticket after a campaign funding scandal rocked Ike's 1952 presidential campaign. For his part, Nixon resented how Ike let him twist in the wind. If that were not enough, in 1956, Ike tried to persuade Nixon to step down as vice president and instead serve in his cabinet. Their relationship turned downright cold during the 1960 campaign when, at a press conference, Ike claimed that he could not recall anything substantive that Nixon had contributed to his administration. Nixon reflected later that there was little personal feeling between us. I gathered that I was considered a trusted lieutenant to the commander, but with the differences in our age and temperament, I was not a personal friend. Kennedy and Johnson's relationship was a marriage of convenience. The Kennedy camp was still seething over LBJ's last-minute maneuvers to steal the nomination at the Democratic Convention in Los Angeles. "I can't stand to be pushed around by that 42-year-old kid," LBJ complained. Unable to add to his delegate count, LBJ tried to force defections from Kennedy by spreading rumors about JFK's health, claiming that he was unfit and unprepared to be president. He told a reporter that Kennedy was a little scrawny fellow with rickets. Johnson's surrogates declared that Kennedy was suffering from Addison's disease, a potentially fatal disorder of the adrenal glands. Although true, Kennedy denied the charge vehemently and went on to win the nomination on the first ballot. Despite Johnson's clumsy effort to block his nomination, the pragmatic Kennedy shocked the convention when he turned around and asked LBJ to join the ticket. But logically it made sense. Johnson was one of the party's most prominent and skilled legislative leaders. The Massachusetts Catholic realized he needed a Southern Protestant on the ticket. Johnson could help in several of the Southern states, especially vote-rich Texas. Kennedy also worried about leaving a disgruntled and temperamental Johnson in the Senate, where he would have the power to block much of his agenda. Ironically, the two opponents in the 1960 presidential contest probably had the closest relationship. Kennedy and Nixon were each elected to Congress in 1946 and served together on the same Education and Labor Committee. In 1952, when Nixon was selected as Eisenhower's running mate, Kennedy, who had also won a Senate seat, wrote him a 2-page handwritten letter calling him an ideal selection that would bring to the ticket a great deal of strength. At the time, the vice president maintained an office in the Senate, and the two men were directly across the hall from each other. Nixon was always invited to Kennedy's office birthday parties. Just as Kennedy supported him in 1952, Nixon promised Kennedy that he would not campaign against the Massachusetts senator when he ran for re-election in 1958. The election had chilled their friendship, but they shared a begrudging mutual respect. Despite their personal rivalries and differences in style and politics, the four presidents on the inaugural platform that day, along with the three who followed, Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, and George H.W. Bush, were bound not just by the presidential office, but also by their experiences in World War II. It would be the defining event of their lives. The war would shape their personalities and help mold their characters more than any other event in their lives. Kennedy spoke for his generation when he said, "The war made us. It was and is our single greatest moment. The memory of the war is a key to our characters. It serves as a breakwall between the indolence of our youths and the earnestness of our manhoods. No school or parent could have shaped us the way that fight shaped us. No other experience could have brought forth in us the same fortitude and resilience. We were much shrewder and sadder when that long battle finally finished. The war made us get serious for the first time in our lives. We've been serious ever since, and we show no signs of stopping." JFK had both an abstract and personal connection with the war. Kennedy was a rising senior at Harvard University when he traveled extensively through Europe in 1938, getting a first-hand look at the brutality of Adolf Hitler's army and the futility of the British effort to appease his ambitions. In August 1939, at the end of a 7-month journey through Europe and the Middle East, the 22-year-old Kennedy looked out his hotel window in Berlin and watched as Nazi stormtroopers marched past. His experience allowed him to frame the question that he would grapple with for the rest of his life, and that would shape his response to a number of crises during his presidency. How do democracies, with their need to respond to public opinion and a web of competing interests, mobilize to confront totalitarian regimes that can marshal the full power of the state for a cause? JFK's reference point was British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's 1938 trip to Munich to negotiate with Hitler, who was demanding to annex parts of neighboring Czechoslovakia. After he returned to London, Chamberlain had told cheering crowds that he had secured peace for our time. Instead, Hitler's armies seized the remainder of Czechoslovakia in 1939 and invaded Poland as well later that year. A generation of Western leaders would learn the lessons of Munich, that aggression needed to be met with force, and compromise with the enemy was futile. On September 3, 1939, 2 days after Hitler invaded Poland, Kennedy sat in the visitors' gallery of Britain's House of Commons, along with his mother, brother Joe, and sister Kathleen. Kennedy listened as a mournful Chamberlain announced that his policy of appeasement had failed. The speaker who made the biggest impression on Kennedy that day, however, was the incoming Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. Kennedy sat transfixed as Churchill inspired the nation with a call to arms. "Outside the storms of war may blow, and the lands may be lashed with the fury of its gales, but in our own hearts this Sunday morning there is peace." Kennedy was witness to the beginning of World War II, an event that would transform him and the nation. With the exception of Ronald Reagan, who spent the war at home in California, each of the future presidents demonstrated enormous courage, volunteering for duty and insisting on being sent directly to the front lines. They were legitimate members of the celebrated greatest generation that defended freedom and democracy from the unprecedented threat posed by Nazi aggression in Europe and Japanese imperialism in the Pacific. The future presidents learned lessons from the war and then tried to implement them when they occupied the Oval Office. Lyndon Johnson could have been speaking for all the future presidents who fought in the war when he said, "From the experience of World War II, I learned that war comes about by two things: by a lust for power on the part of a few evil leaders, and by a weakness on the part of the people whose love for peace too often displays a lack of courage that serves as an open invitation to all the aggressors of the world." For this generation, the Munich analogy served as a conceptual prison that left them blind to the forces of nationalism sweeping through Asia and Latin America, and supremely confident in America's mission to transform the world in its own image. The Munich analogy shaped both how presidents viewed international crises.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?